Hello everyone, Dave Floss here from Prometheus Falling Toys and Mentally Unbalanced. And in today's segment, we're going to talk about 3D printing. So stick around. So in an earlier video, I talked about 3D scanning. So if you're interested to learn more about the 3D scanning that inevitably led to this video on 3D printing, you're going to want to stop and go check that one out first. But if you're here to learn a little bit more about 3D printing, at least my experience with 3D printing, well, then you've come to the right place. So today I'm going to talk about a couple different things in respects to 3D printing. First, everything I'm going to talk about is consumer level 3D printing, right? Stuff you can purchase and use in your home. Secondly, I'm going to talk about my direct experience with it. What am I using it for, and where have I found both some great quality and some fairly significant challenges. And everything I'm going to demonstrate today, any miniatures I'm going to show, are going to be stuff that I did directly to show and demonstrate to you. Now, the first thing is we're going to talk about both types of consumer level 3D printing. The first one is PLA printing, basically a plastic filament, and the other is going to be resin, which is a liquid type. And I'll talk about those in just a moment. But ultimately, I want to share with you first, what was I trying to achieve? So I've been 3D printing for about 2 years now. I started with PLA. I moved over to resin at one point. And ultimately, my intent when I first started 3D printing was to be able to produce my own miniatures. So the key here is that for my goal, it was about small objects with fine detail. And that's where I'm going to kind of focus my attention when I describe and talk through the two different printing types and the various printers that I've used over the last 2 years. Now, that's not to say that, other people may not have had different good or bad experiences with these devices, or a lot of settings being tweaked might have given you better results. But for me, the importance was I don't want to have to get into code and into 300 different variables to ultimately get the type of quality that I was looking for. I wanted something that was going to be fundamentally simple to use and ready to go out of the box. And I've had some mixed experience with that, and that's what I'm going to share today. So I started with PLA printing. And if you don't know what PLA printing is, it is a plastic filament, basically looks like a line of plastic that goes into an extruder, this little box, and the filament goes into it and it heats it up, and then this tiny little print head, this little copper extruding nozzle, literally draws the item layer by layer, building up into a three-dimensional type of figure. Now, there are two 3D printers that I've used. The very first one I had was an X1-2, which sounds really cool. And there are some great advantages to this printer, which I'll show a picture of now. The first thing is it came all in one. It was pretty much ready to go out of the box. It also is completely encapsulated. So the nice thing is that other than attaching the roll of filament to the back, everything was pre-assembled. It's enclosed. It has a touch interface and was very simple to set up. Now, each of the printers I'm going to discuss come with their own software, and that's all I'm really going to talk about today. There is other 3D printing software that it probably goes, and I'm way beyond the settings and capabilities of the in-the-box software that came with these devices. But again, I'm focused on, I want to get in there, get printing, and I ultimately get some good results. So the plus side of the X1 is that everything I've said also, it is fairly simple to set up. It is fairly simple to level the printing bed. And then for those, again, who don't know, when you're printing from a nozzle into a three-dimensional space on a plate, you got to make sure that that plate is level, basically in all four corners and the center. These printers are extruding extremely thin and fine layers of the material. So even the smallest amount of variation in the plate can cause that print to either not come out good or fail completely. But I did find that the ability to adjust and quickly align the plate on the X1 was very simple and straightforward out of the box. So on the downside, which wasn't a big deal for me at the time, was it's not a very big build plate. So of course, depending on what it is you're trying to print, the size of the build plate, the plate that the print area basically for the printer absolutely controls the size of the item that you're able to print. So when you're dealing with a print plate that is maybe only 5 inches by 5 inches, you cannot get any wider or deeper than those dimensions. Now, there's a height capability to it, which is about 8 or 9 inches. But again, if you have a large object that you're trying to print, this may not be the ideal printer for you. So then we go to the next printer that I bought, really to combat that exact issue, the size of the build plate. And this is a fairly common 3D printer, and that's the I always mess this one up. The Creality Ender 3. Now, this one, if a lot of times when anybody searches 3D printer, this is the one that kind of pops up. And I will say that it has a much larger build plate. It also works a little bit differently. The X1 plate is in a static position, and the print head actually moves around. The extruder is what moves. On the Ender, it's the exact opposite. The print head is in a fixed position, and the build plate actually moves. So ultimately, I found that whether the build plate moved or didn't move didn't have a huge impact on the quality of the print. Now, what I did find to be a bit of a challenge with the Ender is that you have to assemble it. And while not overly complex, you have to be extremely thoughtful and follow the instructions to assemble it precisely. As I mentioned earlier, even a very, very small variant in the build plate settings and the armatures, all of the different components that go into building the Ender, if any of those are not fastened correctly and securely, can absolutely impact how this printer will function. Now, the Ender 3 is not print screen. It has a turn dial. But other than that, being able to take an STL file, what is an STL file, you ask? Well, simply put, when you go into your software and you bring in a 3D model, that 3D model is called an STL file. So here we have, in this case, it's Photon software, but we can see that we've brought in our 3D rendering, and this is basically just an STL file. And the software, whether it's for Resin or for PLA, is usually referred to as a slicer. It is something that is looking at the various levels and settings for your printer to build that object. So it has the moniker of slicer. So your STL file, ultimately, when I was working with either the Ender or the X1, both worked extremely well. Straight slicing software, create my STL file, go to my printer, get ready to print. Now, using the prepackaged software, there wasn't a lot of variables that I had to worry about. And there's really not many variables you should need to worry about for most prints. There are a couple things that you might want to tweak, and that is, how fine of a extrusion do you want? How small, basically, do you want it to get? The smaller it is, the longer it will take, but usually the better detail you will get. There's also a few other variables like speed. How fast are the various things moving around? And again, it really equates to the slower and smaller things get, the finer the detail and quality, but you exponentially increase the time. And I will talk about time because that is definitely a factor to consider with any 3D printer, whether PLA or using a resin printer. So let's take a look actually at some of the items that we have here. So we're actually taking a look now at a few different, I have them right over here. We're going to take a look now at a few of the different items that have been done with a PLA printer. And the easiest way to do this is divide a line on your screen, and everything on this side has been done with PLA, and everything on the opposite side has been done with resin. And let's take a look at a couple examples right now. So here's an example of an item printed using some fine settings on a PLA, fine detail setting on a PLA printer. If we move that aside, we can see we have this was a 3D scan of a Unicron head. And you can see those details there. My favorite comparison is really two miniatures that I did, which ultimately are the same miniature, one done in PLA and the other one done in resin. So the one in the gray shirt is PLA, and the one in the yellow shirt is resin. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But if you look at, especially, if you go over here and take a look at the sandworm, and we look at our demon on his throne, absolutely I was able to get really decent quality out of these two printers. Now, most of these are from the X1, just because there's no point in taking out the ender and using it if I do have a very small item to print. But even between the two of them, ultimately the print quality was pretty much consistent. And for what I was doing, it was fairly good. Now, here's the first thing I'm going to talk about when it comes to kind of what's the big difference, or why did I shift to resin? Well, while the quality of these are very good for a PLL printer, there were two big factors that eventually led me to want to at least incorporate resin printing into my prints. The first is time. PLA printing is very, very long. Depending on the size of the print and the complexity of the print, it is usually measured in hours, sometimes in days. Now, the only real risk here is that if you have especially a larger print or a really fine detail, slow print, is that at any point as it's drawing each layer in three-dimensional space, at any point if there's an error or an issue, well, you're starting from scratch. There's not much there's no real going back at that point. And when you're dealing with prints that take hours or days, that can be a lot of lost time. Now, on the flip side, if your settings are good and your printing has been consistent, then usually it's a set it and forget it, walk away, come back to your finished product later. So I'm not trying to scare people, except to say that in definitely some cases where there was some anomaly, either with the printing or with the process, where something didn't quite work out, it was a scrap and start over type of scenario. Now, the other issue that led me to bring in resin as a printing option was the ability to get super fine details. And I'm going to try to give you an example now. If we kind of focus in on these two models, these two miniatures, if we pay attention to things like the face, so if we look at the one in the gray shirt, it actually looks like I have a scowl. And yes, these are actual 3D renders of me that I turned into miniatures. Granted, I did allow myself to reduce my my tummy a little bit, give myself a little bit more of a sleek physique. But if we look at the details around the face, for example, we can see that we didn't quite get the finer details of the expression on my face. I have a face, it came out, but it ultimately looks like I'm squinting and scowling at the same time. And that's because it just didn't get the finer details of the spacing and three dimensions around my eyes, around my nose, etc. And then things like the hands, if you can, if you could get even deeper and you look at, again, those finer details, some of those were lost in the printing process. Now, the exact same file, no changes made to the same file, was then done in resin, which we see in the yellow shirt. And now, as I kind of twist and turn this around, we can see we have a lot more detail in the face. You actually see that I'm raising an eyebrow, that I got a smirk versus a scowl. More detail in things like the shoes and even the texture on the jeans. So the ability for the resin printer to get, especially when you're dealing with really small, highly detailed miniatures, is kind of a big key component. Another example of this, if we look at this other model here, so we look at this model of the wizard as another example of resin printing. We can see that everything down to even the details in the pages of the book, the details around the face, there's a lot of very, very pristine, fine details going on with this item, and ultimately resin ended up doing a much better job. Now, for the resin printing, I am using the Photon Mono, which is another consumer level resin printer. So let's talk about the difference right now, very quickly, between PLA and resin. Well, the simple thing is PLA, as I said, is using a big roll of plastic, and a resin printer is using a liquid medium, a liquid resin medium. And this is where it's kind of neat. The technology is pretty cool, because what it's doing is you're filling a vat with your resin, this liquid, And then the underside of this vat is clear, like clear plastic. And then instead of extruding each layer through a nozzle, it is actually using very precise infrared light and drawing on the surface layer by layer. And everywhere that that light hits, it begins to harden the resin material. So you have this vat, it draws a circle. Now that first layer is a more solid circle. And then there's a plate as opposed to a table that sits and is printed on with PLA. The resin is different. It actually drops a plate, draws that first line right up against the plate. That gets hard. And then as it pulls up and goes back, it draws the next layer. And eventually it actually pulls your object out of the vat of goo, and your 3D object is sitting there on that plate. So, of course, I've already talked about one of the big benefits of this is the fact that it usually can get much finer detail using that ultraviolet/resin. Now, there's a couple drawbacks to resin. The first off is it smells. And depending on which resin you use, it can smell pretty bad, and you really should be in a ventilated space. Now, on the plus side, there are two types of resins. There is a type of resin that you need to clean and produce with alcohol, and then there's a water-based resin. Now, I've heard a lot of reviews online about, well, people much prefer the oil-based or different type that uses alcohol for cleanup from a quality perspective, but it is far more potent and smelly, and ultimately, I wanted to see if I could get really good results with a water-based resin. Now, the water-based still has a bit of an odor to it, but not nearly as noticeable. And the huge difference, which I'll talk about in a minute, is the post-production or cleanup of your miniature. So we're going to take a look at a couple other examples of some resin prints. So first I have a T800 skull. I'm going to turn it here. And I think the focus area here is just looking at the amount of detail in the jaw, in the side of the skull. It's able to capture in an extremely small, just to give you an idea, a little bit maybe taller than a quarter, the amount of fine detail that it's been able to capture. We have another miniature over here. It's a little bit harder to see without the light, but again, able to capture a lot of different detail. Let's take a look at the back, just the back plate. So for my miniature printing, I much prefer using the resin because, again, you just get that much higher level of quality. Another aspect is the consistency of the material itself when it's completed, whereas the PLA is an extremely brittle, solid product. It hardens. It doesn't really have any flexibility to it. It's extremely good in certain cases where you want that. And definitely very easy to work with after the fact. It's easy to clean. It's very easy to paint and work with or seal coat, whatever the case may be. It is just a very solid material. Now, on the flip side, another example I'll put here is this ski. And this is actually a G.I. Joe toy that I talked about in my earlier video where I did a 3D scan and then produced the replica in resin. And ultimately here, there's two reasons I wanted to go with resin. First, I wanted to get the finer details and quality. But the second and probably more important aspect was I wanted it to be something that had just a little bit of give, a little bit of flexibility. If it is something that's going to be snapped into the side of the toy, or I'm going to put G.I. Joe figures on the pegs, and this is probably the easiest way I can describe it. When I create things with a PLA that have small pegs, all of a sudden I put the figure's foot over that into the hole, and if there's even the slightest movement in the wrong direction, it has a tendency to just snap right off. It is a solid and somewhat brittle product, right? Now, when you have just a little bit of flexibility that you get from the resin, it makes a complete difference in really the functionality or how you might be able to use that item. So for a lot of my more interactive toy type stuff, I find resin to be fantastic. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a couple drawbacks to resin I've already described, and really the other issue with resin is it's a little more, I'm going to say, personal time consuming, because unlike waiting for PLA, which is just waiting for it to finish the print, with resin there is a cleanup process required once your print is done. So your item has now finished printing and it's sitting on a plate. So the first thing you have to do is very carefully remove it from that plate. Now at this point, it's going to be drippings with goo. It's going to have all of this other resin, because remember, it's lowering it into this vat over and over again. So it's going to be covered and pretty ooey gooey. So you have to clean it. You have to clean off all of that liquid, loose resin that's not actually part of your model. Now again, if it's water-based, that's not too challenging. Run it in the sink. Another important factor, though, is it hasn't been cured yet. And that's another big piece. Resin needs to cure. When you first take it off its build plate and during the cleaning process, it is an extremely soft and flexible material. It's only used enough light from that infrared beam to create the shapes and design. It has not actually final cured the item into kind of your final quality. So you have to be thoughtful when you're cleaning it. And again, I like water-based. I find the quality is fine and the cleanup is so much easier. I'm not using alcohol or an alcohol bath. I'm just cleaning it with water and I'm getting the results that I want. Now, once you've cleaned it, and there's a couple different ways you can clean it. You could bring it over to your sink. You could run it in there. You could use a little very light, soft brush to wash it down with some water. And of course, the folks who make my resin printer also make something they call a wash and cure station. And if you're going to make the investment in a resin printer, there's really nothing stopping or should stop you from then going one step and getting the item that's then going to allow you to easily clean and then cure your item. So in this case, we have the wash and cure station. I'll show a picture of it for you. And what the wash and cure station allows me to do is drop this item into a container that's filled with water, and it runs a fan to swirl that water in multiple directions and clean off all of the loose resin. Now, once that's done, I remove my item, I gently pat it down and make it dry, and then I place it right back into the same machine because it has an infrared light bar. I put the cover on it, and then, depending on the size of my model, 1 or 2 minutes, and it will bombard the item with those rays and cures or hardens to the final product. Now, again, because of how much I've cured it, it still has some flexibility. It's not going to snap off in my hands. But you can control how much the curing is done based on the amount of time that you put it in the curing station and bombard it with that light. So there's a lot of flexibility, but you have to understand there's a lot more potentially involved when you're dealing with resin versus PLA. So one other aspect of resin, besides the amount of additional steps involved in both setting up, cleaning, and curing the item, is that most consumer level resin printers are not very large. If we take a look at my screen here, we can see that we have this 3D rendering, and the size of the build plate that you see beneath it is the actual size of space. So when you see the size of the ski that I was doing, you realize there's not a lot of room to work with. Great for small items and miniatures, not so much if you're getting into larger prints. You're going to have to break them into parts in order for them to fit or print one at a time on the print bed. Now, that being said, let's talk about time, because time is absolutely a big factor in both of these types of printing mediums. So the first thing is, if you have an item in PLA that you're printing, and let's just say we have the ski, okay? This particular ski, let's just say, takes about an hour to an hour and a half, and that is building it up layer by layer. Now, if I want to do 2 skis side by side, pretty much you're doubling the time because every single item is being drawn in line at that time. So 2 skis is 2 to 3 hours, 3 skis, you get the meaning. It gets larger. And again, when you have a larger print, that is multiple hours. A key piece of that, maybe not so much for the ski, but let's take a quick look, for example, at our T800 head, is that with a PLA printer, it is going to be printing the outside layers as well as doing a fill-in. It's not actually filling in. It's not solid all the way through. With PLA, it's going to build pretty much a lattice work or a frame or a structure to give it some some structure, but it's not actually filling in all of the empty spaces. In other words, on PLA, this would be mostly hollow. It's only going to be filling in maybe about 15% of the non-visible space to both conserve time. Now, you can fill in all of it, and let me just say, you're going to be waiting an extremely long time and using a lot of material that is not actually necessary. I said earlier that once PLA is done, it is a hardened plastic, so it doesn't necessarily need to be filled in at 100%. That lattice work created on the inside gives it the strength that it needs without having to use nearly as much material. Now, you might think that with resin, it would take longer as it's getting much finer details and doing a lot more fill than you potentially see in PLA. Interestingly enough, the opposite is true. Because of the mechanism by which resin is using this ultraviolet light to harden and cure layer by layer, it generally is in the exact same amount of time. In other words, I would expect this to be about an hour on a resin printer. I know this as well because it took an hour on my resin printer. Now, here's an interesting thing, and I wish I could explain it in better detail, but I don't necessarily know why. But if I put 2 of these on my printer bed and decide to do 2 at the same time, unlike PLA, which is pretty much double, this is about 1 1/3 times longer. So an hour becomes an hour and 20 minutes. I'm not sure I can explain why. I'm sure it has something to do with the way the ultraviolet lights are spread and how fast it can move those lights. But ultimately speaking, you can print an item and double up, triple up, have multiples of that item, and it does not significantly change the amount of time of the print nearly as much as PLA does. Again, it's going to be more fractional increments than full-on double up increments. So where does that leave us? Where do we end with this conversation? Well, again, if you're looking at printing large, simple items, different types of things, you might be perfectly thrilled with PLA. And for some of the larger items I do, I have 0 complaints about my PLA printing. I've been extremely happy with the way that some of my larger prints have turned out in PLA. Now, the one thing I will say is that PLA, even at its finest detail and quality, does have a tendency to leave just the smallest, barely visible lines with each layer, almost like the rings on a tree. You can actually trace and see some of those lines. Now, you can get away with a lot as far as if you're going to seal or paint or cover that material, but it is something to note that on really small, fine line miniatures, like that miniature of me I showed you earlier, you can see, even at that small size, those individual lines. And I was able to cover them up okay with paint, but if you're looking for them, you'll still be able to find them. Maybe if you're not looking, they'd be a little bit less noticeable. Now, from a cost perspective, you can really do well in either realm, right? And when it comes to the consumables, I think it's important, without trying to put exact prices, is that what you're going to spend on PLA is comparable to what you'll spend on resin. And they do go a long way. A bottle of resin like this could do dozens, if not over 100 miniature prints. And at anywhere from $15 to $25 a bottle, well, you can do the math, but right there you're talking about pennies or quarters, nickels, dimes per miniature. That is, for me, to be able to produce multiples of things or items that I've purchased online and create those, that is a huge savings versus going out and trying to buy various miniatures, especially duplicates if I'm army building, for example. A huge amount of time saving. So really, from a cost perspective, one might be a little higher or lower than the other. But when you really put it all together as a complete package, and you're going for what specifically it is you're trying to accomplish, the cost is not so significant that I would say you clearly should lean toward one or the other. Go with the one that's going to give you the best possible result for what it is that you're trying to achieve. Now, there's a couple other what I'm going to call potpourri or little tidbits that I'm going to share with you now. And this is specifically about the materials that you can order, as well as some tips that I've learned that have really improved the quality and output of my prints. So the first thing is, let's take a look again at our 3D rendering here. Now, this is resin, but it really would apply to resin or PLA in almost the exact same fashion. And this is specifically supports. Now remember, when you're building something in 3-dimensional space, let's use a good example here. We have the horns on Unicron. Now, if this is on PLA, it is building from the bottom up. So as it gets to the point where it's trying to build this horn, it has to be building that, starting from here and slowly building it out, building out, building out, building it out. The key here is that oftentimes if something is not supported all the way from the bottom, it will not have enough strength and these items could break off, fall off, etc. Let's look at our ski as an example. Now remember, this is resin, so it's actually building it on a plate upside down. But let's take a look right here. The challenge we're going to have here is this sled right here. This part is being built right on the plate. So it's going to really be able to adhere. We've got a little bit of an angle here, but it should be able to build that layer by layer. And then it's going to build up these two sides, and then it's going to try to build this very first extremely thin layer. And that is exactly where it is likely to fail. That is, it's trying to produce that super thin layer, even the smallest amount of movement, moving the plate, going through the resin. It could deform that, and immediately you've lost the quality, if not the ability to the final product. The final print won't turn out. So the first thing is you just got to give it some support. You got to get a little something to add some strength. Now, most software will come with its own support. And we can look right here that I can hit a button, and immediately the software is going to say, based on what I'm looking at, you should be building up some scaffolding. And you can see it's exactly where I thought it would be. It's building up a scaffolding to support that other layer that it's going to build. Now you can go in and you could decide if you want to put a few manual supports in, you want the software to do it, you might want to take some out, because ultimately this is going to be printed in 3D with your model. Now generally speaking, when supports are added, the software is intelligent enough to know they're not meant to stay. So it uses really small, very fine, if we zoom in here, really small, very fine points of contact that usually can be removed fairly easily. But you should absolutely, when you're looking at your 3D model and you've generated supports, look where those supports are needed, but also get an idea of where they're going to be when you need to clean them up, as some could truly be challenging to remove after the fact. Now, I have found resin supports to be much easier to remove than PLA. Again, it has something to do with it not being quite so brittle and hardened to the same degree as PLA. But with a little bit of trial and error, or trust the software to at least give you a first pass, you'll definitely get a sense of where supports tend to be needed and the challenge and uniqueness of trying to remove those supports after the fact. The most important lesson when removing supports is be gentle. If you're working really hard to remove a support that's being stubborn and you give it a little bit too much oomph, you are likely to break off, especially if it's something supporting. For example, if we have this miniature here, which had his sword sticking out, well, there were some supports holding up that sword. If I'm too aggressive with trying to remove those supports, I'm just as likely to break the sword off as I am to remove those supports. So using tweezers and fine tools can make a big difference, and be patient with your design. Now, the other item I said I was going to mention is, well, what about the materials themselves? Well, we've already talked about PLA versus resin. But what's really kind of nice and interesting is that regardless of which you go with, there are a lot of different color options. Here I have white PLA. I could have black. There's a whole rainbow of colors of PLA products out there that you can use. Similarly with resin, there's a lot of different, from straight gray type of resin to this semi-transparent red that I used for this. And really, again, you can choose a resin that maybe will give you a final product and it's ready to go. You're good to go. Or in my case, I like to use gray or some of the other more flat matte colors because I intend to paint or add details to them later. So it gives me a very good base medium, base color to work with. So there you have our video on 3D printing using both PLA and resin type printers, or at least my experiences using them. What experiences have you had with 3D printing, good or bad? Please leave your comments and tell us what the products, devices, any of the things that you've learned in your journey of 3D printing. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, we'd love it if you'd subscribe so that we can bring you more videos in the future. Until then, happy printing. I'm Dave Floss with Mentally Imbalanced and Prometheus Falling Toys, and we will talk to you soon.